All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Martin, and joining me today, as Laura mentioned, is David Payton. And today we're going to talk about tips and guidelines for working with the media when a crisis hits. And I think you'll find that our discussion is going to be very timely, and hopefully we hope that you get a good value out of this discussion. So let's begin real quick. First, I promise the only sales thing I'm going to say is Atlas Marketing. We're based in Pittsburgh, and we have another office in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and we tell stories for people who build things, design things, manufacture things. David, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm good. I think they did a wonderful job, so it's good enough.
Fair enough. Fair enough. We'll do the same thing. We'll skip over that. I like that. So as far as our expectations today, one of the things that we always talk about in crisis communications and media training is the word opportunity. And you're going to hear me in particular talk about that, use that word quite a bit today in our discussions. As you can see here on the slide, we look at a crisis as an opportunity to not only strengthen the corporate reputation of an organization, but also your personal and in your own branding as it relates to your individual career. More importantly, it also gives us an opportunity to strengthen some media relations. So we're going to talk about that. And by the end of our discussion today, you should feel pretty confident that you'll have the ability to create a crisis communications plan and prepare. I know that when David is going to share some real life scenarios, he's going to talk about preparation a lot. The goal here today is to help you speak with the media with a goal in mind. And we're going to share some tips and tricks on how to handle that. And then also to manage that conversation with the media so that there is no misinformation. And we all know that in today's world, battling misinformation is half the battle. So we're going to talk with that today. So before we begin, I'd like to just define what a crisis is. And admittedly, a crisis is stressful. But as it relates to our discussion today, our definition is a crisis is a potential brand damaging incident that requires a media response. And you're going to see that media response, it kind of adds a little bit of a twist to the response, as well as the crisis communications plan that you have worked so hard to create. So with that, I want to try to give you a real life scenario. So my partner, David, is going to share with you some experiences throughout our discussion today that he has actually dealt with, and then we'll talk about how to move forward with that. So David, when you're ready.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, if you want to go ahead to the next slide, this is something like what Chris was talking about, crisis. You just never know when, where it's going to strike, right? So this is a real life crisis we're going to talk about. It's unplanned incidents of fire. And we can go ahead and forward that to the next slide. And this fire took place just, out of the blue, just decided it was going to go off that day. And here's what happened, right? It was an 800-foot oil tanker, right? Fire in the bottom of the tank. I think you're going the wrong way on the slides, Chris. But it was an 800-foot oil tanker. Fire was in the bottom of the tank, right? And as is too often in crises, you don't get a notice, right? There's no notice of emergency, things like that. It just happens. EMS is called, right? It's beyond the company's capability to control, so we had to call emergency services in. And this type of incident is noticeable for miles. So you're in a bay area, right? And in a bay area, when you see a cloud of smoke this big, and it's in a bay in a downtown area, so you're looking at, all the buildings around it, across the bay, where you're at on this side, everyone can see it. And typically downtown areas like this, there's a lot of touristy things that go on, right? Museums, parks, all this kind of stuff. So it's noticeable to a lot of people, right? So, what kind of happened, right? Fire department responds, right? The media, of course, always they see a big cloud of smoke, and all the different news outlets, right? They're fired up, ready to go. There's some news going on, and the community in the world soon knows, right? You'll see across national news, fire in Tampa Bay, right? And then people tune into that and they're like, oh, what's going on there? And all of a sudden, in just moments, everybody knows what's going on in your world, right? The world seemed to be small when the morning started, but it got very large in just a small amount of time. And now media is even more prevalent because everybody with an iPhone and a camera or any type of device walking by becomes their own reporter, right? Gets on all the media platforms. So it's so much more than it used to be veins of controlling media. Because, back in the day when the camcorders were, 24 inches long and 10 inches wide, not everybody was walking around with those. So our world has become a lot more fluid in who the people are that's filming these things and pushing these things out into the world. So the questions are were we prepared, right? We did have a communications plan. Crisis management is very important. I learned early in my career when I had some crises that happened and we weren't prepared as a company, and news reporters and things showed up that, we should have had a better plan than this, than just trying to wing it, right? Because I always felt when I was younger, I was good with people, good with cameras, never really had nervousness, but winging it is not the way you want to go in a crisis. So what Chris is going to talk about as we move forward, really having a good communications plan was very important, right, to what we were doing. We had to understand, who was going to talk to the public, how much information was going to be given, what might need to be ran by an attorney, those type of things, what communication needed to be held internally. We needed to make sure that our people were trained, right? Understand that not just everybody does well in front of a camera, especially during a crisis situation. And then we had to train those people and make sure they understood maybe it's classes in how they present, how they publicly speak, understanding how to give them the information that they should share, the information that they shouldn't share, and how to think on their feet in those type of situations. So a lot of work goes into training these personnel and making sure that you select the right personnel for this type of thing. And then tabletop exercises, right? You want to put people through the thing. We would run live tabletop exercises and make sure everyone knew how to actually react. I mean, we'd almost do it like a mock court case trial. Sometimes we would bring in actual live media reporters and things like that, just so they had good grilling questions and kind of put them on the spot and shot at them rapid fire style, right? And then try to get them off their game real quick. And it was, you'd be surprised when you go through real exercises how much it prepares you better. But there are some things in every crisis, right, that we're not prepared for, like that last bullet point that says firefighter posting selfies on Twitter, right? And that's why say what? So in this particular instance, we had a firefighter that was on the ladder of the fire truck, right? And he decided that it was a good time to take a selfie so he could show everybody that he's saving the world, and make sure that all that stuff was being communicated to all his friends, all the other people that, get on his Twitter feed, or just random people that can look and search Twitter up in different tweets, right? He just wanted to make sure it was out there and everybody knew how awesome he was, and never thought about the possible damage, right, that could be done to a company, a situation, things like that. And we had to, things like this aren't expected, and you've got to figure out how do you respond to that. So on something like that, we had to call up the fire chief. We had to talk to the city and explain, about removing that post. You came on private property, and this is not a training exercise that you're using for educational purposes. It's just somebody who wanted to advertise himself per se. And I get it that it would look cool and it was a cool situation, cool experience, but those little things like that can really do detriment to a company. And then whatever he puts on that hashtag, right, it lives with your company. So you got to really be prepared, because you're not just preparing yourself for your company. Like in this case, we're also trying to protect the customer, right, in which that fire started. So it's not just the company that I was with, but it's also the tanker company who has, the same type of responsibilities when you're looking at these type of incidents, because it can affect that around us, the environmental impact, right? You're going to have other government agencies that's going to come in and be part of this besides just the media, right? You're going to have the EPA and things like that with this type of emissions. So you got to be prepared. Right. And we were prepared, but we weren't prepared for everything, because there's certain things that you can be as close to as possible. If they still pull a trick out on you, it seems like that you're not really ready for. So preparation is probably one of the best things that you can do. And I'm going to turn that back over to Chris, and he's going to talk more about preparation.
Thanks, David. And that is a perfect segue into what we want to talk about next. And if I can actually get this working properly, I'll be happy. So David talked about preparation, and I couldn't agree more. And I really liked what he said. What happens in a crisis lives with your company, and I've seen it time and time again, and I couldn't emphasize that enough. And so with that, the steps that are necessary to prepare are just real basic things, but are going to be really helpful as you start to develop your crisis communications plan. So one of the big keys that we always share with folks as we're developing a crisis communications plan is there are three kind of immutable laws, if you will, or three facts that are always going to happen in a crisis. And it all relates around the people. So whether that is your team, your stakeholders, the media, outside stakeholders, in the instance that David shared, the tanker company, as well as the harbor and the state and the local community, all of those things relate to a crisis. And why this is important, I'm going to get to in a second, but the real takeaway here is that during a crisis, people are going to absorb, process, and act on the information in totally different ways. Just like David said, the firefighter thought it was a really great way to promote himself or herself in this instance. But the actual aspect of it is that information is now going out there in so many different ways. And so why is this important? Well, the reason that we start there is information is currency as it relates to a crisis situation. And that currency helps people make decisions. And those decisions focus around whether I want to go to the harbor, for example, that day. Do I want to work with this company in the future? Do I want to engage with the environment as a result of this crisis or this situation? So there, again, people absorb things in so many different ways, but what's important in this is developing your crisis plan so that you have that opportunity. And again, there's that word, there's opportunities here, that you're going to have the ability to manage your corporate reputation. You're going to have the ability and the opportunity to share your story or your message. And I think one of the biggest takeaways and why understanding that information is currency in any situation, but it's amplified in a crisis situation, is because of the last two bullet points there on the right. You have the opportunity to influence media coverage. And I'm not saying, influence in a way that is, negative toward the outcome, but you have the ability and the opportunity to positively move the coverage in a way that's going to help that corporate reputation. And then more importantly, you have the opportunity to improve, public perception. And some of our companies are publicly traded companies. So there's going to be a big impact on what happens as a result of the crisis. That's why we always want to say and start to think of the information that we're going to share as currency, because that way it brings more value, but ultimately it helps in those decisions. So I mentioned corporate reputation, and I just want to touch on this real quick. Your corporate reputation has such an impact on not only sales, profit, but ultimately recruitment and your future workforce. So how things are measured and how a corporation is actually measured is a result of crisis situations. David's situation where he just shared with us the social media ramifications of a firefighter taking selfies over top of a tanker. That has a positive and a negative impact, to be honest. So it's important to understand how that corporate reputation and the information that you're going to be capturing and sharing during a crisis situation has the impact that it has on your corporate reputation. And one other thing too, feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and we'll be able to answer that throughout the discussion. So don't feel like we're just talking to you. Just to reiterate what Laura had said. So let's start to talk a little bit about preparation. And I know that we're talking with safety professionals from all over the country. So that first question, we're just going to assume you have a safety program in place. But I think the second question there is it up to date? I think those are some questions that you need to ask yourself as you start to prepare a crisis communications program or a plan. And then some of us may know what to do when a crisis hits. And the bigger question though is, how is my team going to respond? And I'm certain that David, we spoke about this earlier, and David can tell you how his team responded to that situation that he was just referring to. But that's because of the fact that they prepared. They had a plan in place. They talked about things. They went through the situation before it actually occurred. And that's the whole idea behind a crisis communications plan. And then the last question there in terms of the preparation before you even sit down and put pen to paper is, can my business survive this type of a crisis? And I will tell you that 99% of the time, businesses do survive, but you can survive it very well, or you can just survive it. And a lot of that is based on your crisis response. So as you're preparing your business, obviously you want to establish a crisis communications plan. As David mentioned, review, practice, and updating that plan is going to be extremely important as you get into the mindset of developing this plan. And then also too, and I think this is a big element, the business ramifications of creating a crisis communications plan is pretty strong. We have seen clients who their insurance premiums have dropped, their healthcare premiums have decreased. And when I say dropped and decreased, I'm not talking 50%. However, there was a decrease. It might have been 5-10%. Any of the decrease in insurance premiums and healthcare is a massive help. So as you're preparing those and making those first initial steps, that's something that you want to be prepared for, and talk with other leaders in your company to make sure that that's a positive benefit of this crisis communications plan. So a typical crisis communications plan includes these elements. And what we try to do when we're working with clients is we obviously customize the plan. For David working in a harbor, or for Erickson as he does now, having the ability to customize that plan is going to be extremely important, not only for him, but for his team as well. So just as we did before we started this conversation, we defined crisis and what that is. And I think it's important for you to define that crisis or crises multiple crises. How's that? For your company, whether it's a construction site, whether it's a manufacturing plant, they're going to have different situations are going to be required to be defined so that you're prepared. The next step in that plan is establishing who your team members are, but more importantly, what their role and responsibilities are. We had a situation with a construction client, a general contractor, who their main receptionist was a part of the crisis team. And as we were going through a scenario where we did a tabletop exercise, just like David mentioned earlier, but we actually practiced a death on a job site. And we found that in this situation, the person that we were going to put in as responsible for gathering information about things just wasn't capable of that, because once we threw a death into that scenario, she had a very difficult time getting over that. So that's one of the other advantages of practicing is you find where your team shines and where they just aren't as strong. So that's another element. Your messaging, and we're going to talk about that as we proceed through our discussion today. The messaging element of your crisis communications plan really should focus on some real basic things. Who we are, what we do, why we do it, where we do it, and how we do those things. And admittedly, I'm simplifying it, but the reality of it is your communications team, your marketing team, they're going to have input in this scenario and in this section of the plan. And the biggest thing that I would tell you to avoid in the messaging development process is don't make too many. Don't create an abundance of messages, because when the crisis comes, they're all going to be thrown out the window, because you're going to have to be very specific in that situation. You're also going to want to have the policies and procedures of your company and make them available. Typically, those would be an appendix or a section that is set aside within your communications plan. And those are more for resource and guidelines and just to spot check things to make sure that things are moving in your response according to plan. And then you're going to have a lot of resources available. You're going to have, based on the specific crisis that you've defined, you're going to want to have specific checklists and guidelines around that crisis. And more importantly, you're going to want to have some spokesperson guidelines so that that spokesperson, whoever that is able to prepare real quick in advance. And there's two things I just want to say about spokesperson. One, I highly encourage you never to have your CEO as the spokesperson. And there's a reason for that. In a crisis situation, you want your CEO to be focused on the operations of the business. Just as we defined a crisis at the beginning of our discussion as an impact to your operations, your CEO should be focused on managing the operations, and you should have someone else in that C-suite or a communications professional as the spokesperson. And then the other side of that too is you only want to have one spokesperson. I can't emphasize that enough. And David kind of reinforced that when he was going through his tanker issue. So again, ask questions as we're going through this, but I think it's important that you keep your CEO away from the spotlight in these situations. So I'm going to hand it over to David for another scenario, and then we'll continue.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I think one thing that Chris touched on is, having people trained, identifying, where their weaknesses, strengths are, and if they're really fit for the role. And I'll say, as we came through these situations, it's finding not only training those people in depth, but also the funnel to those people. So you got to make sure down to every level that everyone understands that when there is a crisis, right, who do they need to bring in? Who do they need to involve? That way that you make sure that the right person gets to that crisis at the right time. Because what happens a lot of times is and we'll talk about this here on this next incident. What happens a lot of times is if the people forget during the crisis or are not trained during the crisis, then they don't bring the team in quick enough to start all the countermeasures, right? So we need to make sure that you're training all the way down as far as, hey, if there's a crisis, these are the people that need to be contacted, right? And make sure that that's available for everyone, and you're sending out, reminders, guidance, even sometimes, hotlines to call in case of something like this happens. So just something to be mindful of. You want to train all the way throughout the organization to make sure everyone knows, if not how to handle it, how to get in contact with the people who do. So that brings us to kind of this next incident. Now the last incident, right? Major, can be seen from miles around, going to have a lot of publicity, going to have a lot of attention from local community, from government associations, the customer themselves, all those type of things. But this next incident was really just kind of a standard incident. So if you want to move to the next one, it is one of those things that can just kind of happen here and there, right? But it's not necessarily a limelight type incident. Had an employee that fell 10 feet into the tank. There was a bunch of rubber hose on the bottom of the tank from where they were ventilating it. So the person, kind of fell into a bunch of rubber hose. But it was about 1 a.m. in the morning, right? So it's nighttime. We get into that night shift, right? Things are more relaxed, things are more docile, because there's typically not as much spotlight on night shift work, right? There was a new supervisor, and that supervisor got nervous and, just decided to call 911 before assessing. He didn't ask the person if he was all right. He didn't ask the person if there was any issues. Just went straight to, oh, he fell into the tank. Let's call 911. So, but before EMS arrives, right, and then before that supervisor speaks to anybody from like a crisis management team, this is all already transpired. So EMS, we get on site. Once we get notified, our personnel get on site, and then the employee just crawls out of the tank on his own fruition. So we didn't even check to see if he was just okay, right? We just automatically called 911. And so as in case of 911, they do what they're supposed to do. They respond. So the local EMS responds, right? And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, when the local EMS gets there, boom, out pops a camera crew, the night crawler crew, from the back of the ambulance. And this is in a facility that is highly regulated, right? So this facility is governed by the Coast Guards, governed by Homeland Security, being a port area. So there is, it's TWIC identification, and we have facility security plans, all these types of things. And if you go past, right, if you go past what they call the breach line, that becomes a Homeland Security incident, just for somebody going past the breach line. Now, they allow emergency services to come in, but when a camera crew pops past there, right, and then it's every single point is a possible point of failure. So something as simple as there's a security guard at those at the entrance gate of that place, right? But the security guard never thought to ask the ambulance driver and the emergency people, hey, do you have a camera crew in the back? Because if you do, you need them to get out first, right? Nobody just thinks that way. Nobody just thinks that you see the flashing lights coming, you're like, I'm gonna make sure these people get to where they need to go so they can handle any situation in case someone's hurt, right? So that's what they did. They let them through, and then the camera crew pops out. Luckily, it just happened to be one of those days, that I was actually on site doing kind of like a night shift audit, where I just wanted to come in and just see how everybody's doing, just kind of a wellness check and see how everything was going. And I just happened to luckily be there, and I heard on the radio, hey, ambulance is coming through the gates. So I go to meet the ambulance, and then all of a sudden, boom, pops out the Nightcrawler crew, and I'm in a golf cart, and I may have sped a little bit in the golf cart that day. I'm not going to lie there. But we get there and we have to talk to the camera crew because they already started filming. And that's the way these type of camera crews work, right? They hop out, action, ready to go. So we stop them, and then, same thing. How are we prepared, right? You look at, we had the communications plan, right? We had the trained personnel, we had the tabletop exercises, but in that communications plan, we found in this that we didn't ever tell the security guard to stop and ask the ambulance or fire and rescue or anything. We've never put it in there for them to ask a question like, do you have any civilian personnel, or do you have any camera crew, or do you have anybody that's not part of your battalion crew or whatever it is, right? But we knew after that day that was something we were going to add to our plan. So that plan is also remembering that as situations happen, learn and adjust the plan, right? But that camera crew popping out, I mean, that's exactly what I felt like, that koala in the tree, right? You got to be kidding me. You can't write this stuff. But this is the things that happen, and it's why you have to have people who are trained and well prepared. We actually had to call, and you wouldn't think this, but we actually had to call California. So I had to find and track down the camera crew, where the tape goes, and who produces their media. And it was actually a company out of California. So I had to call and get all the rights to the story, make sure that they didn't publish it because they were on private property. They didn't have the permission because it was also federally protected property, and let them know they didn't have the permission. And it was a little bit of a fight because, that whole freedom of speech, and the ambulance allowed them to ride with them. And I was like, and I had to explain to them that that's not legal, right, or not lawful, and had to go through the rounds a little bit, and then send some written documentation over to them to get them to sign, saying that not only will they get rid of it, they'll destroy the tape and it'll never be used, right? And then I had to ask them for confirmation back that was done. So those are legally binding documents, and that's sometimes, things that you learn, right, with situations like that, is when you have to get certain information, you have to ensure that it's not just out there. These companies are made and designed to keep as much as possibly. And if I wouldn't have had it signed for that it had to be completely deleted, destroyed, then they may have been able to publish a clip of what happened, right? And that's all it takes, is just something getting out there that can be detrimental. And then plus, as Chris alluded to, we wanted to control the narrative on this. We didn't need a Nightcrawler crew producing something that said, man falls and is severely injured in, incident tank in a tank, right? Or whatever, because they're not going to put a caption on there like, oh, it was no big deal, or it was a minor incident, we really shouldn't even showed up for it. They're not going to say that, right? They're going to get whatever pushes the headlines for them. So learning how to have that, be prepared, and be in control of the situation. If you train your people right, you're doing the right type of exercises, your people will be able to think on their feet, right? When unexpected things happen, even in small incidents. And that's the thing. We don't know that a small incident won't turn into something large. So we always have to be prepared to ensure that everybody's safe and the company is going to be well, and to make sure that nothing negative happens out of it. So, just again, always be mindful, big or large, the preparation, we can't say it enough, right? And then making sure that you're investing in your company and your people to understand how to handle these situations. Chris, back to you.
All right. Very well said. And who would have ever thought that you would have to prepare or even think of a camera crew jumping out of an ambulance, especially in that situation. So as David mentioned, you can prepare all you want, and there's always going to be a curveball come your way. So I think that's a great takeaway from what we're talking about today. So great segue into how to incorporate the media into your response. I mean, right now we've talked about the crisis communications plan and what's involved in that. Let's talk a little bit about the media and their expectations, but then more importantly, just as David mentioned, how you manage the story. We're going to talk about that as well and take it a little bit further as we into this next section of our discussion. So the media, we all know it's their job to gather information, and admittedly, some outlets are on the level. Obviously, the camera crew that jumped out of an ambulance isn't quite on the level, but okay, they're still gathering information. But the one thing that when we talk with clients a lot, there's kind of this understanding that they're going to talk to at least one person. But the reality of it is the media is going to talk to as many people as they can find. And I think that's important, because even though you may be sitting in your office and get a phone call from a reporter or a producer who wants to talk about the incident, you can be assured that they're talking to at least 4 or 5 other people. And so that is why what David said in managing the story is so vital to how things are perceived as a result of a crisis situation. And I'll tell you, the media is going to ask so many of the same questions in such a variety of different ways. It becomes a borderline, a little bit annoying, but if you understand that their job is to kind of like become kind of like Columbo, if you recall that TV show where they'd ask a bunch of questions and then all of a sudden at the end, oh, by the way, that's a typical tactic that some reporters will use. And we talk about that a lot in our media training sessions and the like. But I think it's important for you as the safety professional to protect your business. And there are some expectations that you should have as the spokesperson or the safety pro behind the scenes, or the crisis communications manager. One, obviously, is to protect your business, protect yourself as well, and your team. You've developed a crisis communications plan. Now it's time to follow it, just like you would your safety plan on a site or a location. And you should also have the expectation that it's your opportunity. There's that word again, the opportunity to share your side of the story, just as David mentioned. So let's talk about that for a second. We kind of have these interview bill of rights, and the idea here is to kind of give you the confidence that when you're talking with a reporter, or cameras in your face, or multiple microphones are in front of you, you should feel confident. And that more importantly, the idea here behind this is to get you in the right mindset. And that mindset is to make sure that your message is heard, that you're not only establishing credibility, but you're eliminating the opportunity for any misinformation. So, and we designed this specifically so that you have, on the left there, you're owning the information. And I think it's important for you as either the spokesperson or the safety professional involved in the crisis communications plan development, is that you take the mindset of ownership. And just like we said earlier, information's currency. Well, owning that information is going to be extremely valuable as you're communicating with the media. Obviously, you want to be concise, you want to be clear, and as honest as possible. There's clearly some situations where you're just not going to be available to share information as an investigation's ongoing, for example. Unfortunately, we've helped some school districts in school shootings. So the idea there in terms of being honest is allow the information to be shared, but if you're dealing with underage kids or underage employees, you want to be mindful. So there's a level of honesty that you can share, and obviously the ability there to establish your credibility. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But I think before I do that, I want to just emphasize 3 little words that are your golden ticket, if you will. There is absolutely nothing wrong with telling a reporter, I don't know. Especially in the heat of a crisis situation, or any interview for that matter. There's absolutely nothing wrong with saying those three words. I don't know. Because you're being honest, you're being forthright, and you're also establishing some credibility. But to really solidify that credibility, you need to be able to follow it up with that last sentence there, which is, I don't know the answer to that, but let me get back to you. Because again, your information that you have is the currency of how this situation is going to be perceived. So to help to establish that credibility, we always tell people that we want to talk in a single voice. So that means, just as David mentioned earlier, we want to have one spokesperson, and we want to have one message and one voice. And that really helps to bring everything together so that we're not sharing too much information, but more importantly, we are making sure that it's consistent over the course of the situation. And we're going to talk about this in a second in terms of packaged answers, but we want you to repeat that message throughout. For example, in the harbor incident, or the fire incident in the Tampa Bay area, one message would be, we're working with local authorities. And so to continue to reinforce that over and over and over again allows the media to understand that you're doing the right things. You're not just, it's a fire, it'll burn itself out, the oxygen will go away at some point. You've got ownership, you've got credibility, and you're doing those things. And I think if there's one key element to this entire discussion today, I want you to take away from this, and that is, never say no comment. I can't emphasize that enough. And the reason for that is, up until this point in our discussion, we've established a crisis communications plan. We've got messaging. We've got our single voice. We've got our message. There's no reason to hide behind that comment of no comment. You have the ability to influence the discussion and influence the story and the coverage. So why wouldn't you? Especially as David's reinforced already, we're preparing all the way up until this moment. So again, here's the opportunity to own that information and share it. So David, I'm going to throw it back to you for a couple takeaways from your scenarios before we talk a little bit more about the media and how to deal with it.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And yeah, you can go ahead and pop to the next slide. So I love the quote, right? Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth, right? And that's true to life. And sometimes we don't plan enough. So that means when we get hit in the mouth, it really goes bad, right? And then sometimes when we're well planned, we get hit in the mouth. It's just an uncomfortable feeling, right? So depending on how well you are prepared, depends on how well you take that punch in the mouth, right? But it will change what you do and how you react. So, certain things about managing issues, and some of the incidents that we talked about, sometimes, signage becomes noise that nobody looks at and things like that. But you'll find, like in the situation with like the camera crews and the selfies, having that signage that there was no authority, right, to publish, to take pictures, that this was private property, no one was allowed without, proper approval. That's where I can come back from a legal position and say, hey, no one had the authority to be here, right? So therefore, everything that you did on this premises, was illegal. So it's little things like that, something as simple as signage, you think about posting it around your facilities, your job sites, things like that says no photos taken, right? No recordings, just simple little things that you can do. Learning how to speak, right? So something happens with the fire department or, camera crews, whatever it is, right? Sometimes in our minds, we think, well, what control do I have over them? Well, it's not about having control over them. It's about having a conversation with them, right? How they're supposed to conduct themselves, how they're supposed to react. right? So it's not that you're telling the local government what to do, but rather you're communicating with the local government to say, right, this is not becoming conduct, and it's not really lawful to do, what was done. So we're asking, right? I'm not telling them, we're asking them that they do the right thing, right? And typically, when you're speaking to a government, they understand the legal problems as well. They understand the press. They understand what it would look like, if someone else produced negative press towards them for the mistakes that they made, right? So they'll understand these things, but managing these issues means that you're going to have to dig in a little bit, right, and do things that might be out of your comfort zone, or things that you've never thought about as you being able to do before. So how to respond to those surprises, right? The team needs to be agile, because you never know what's going to happen. I didn't know before that day. I didn't know exactly how to retract media that has been taken. And not only did I not know how to do it, I also had to research where this company was actually out of, because they were in Florida, but managed out of California, and that's where all the feeds go to. And then there was an hour delay because of time zone, things like that, where they don't even get the media for usually 6 to 8 hours after it happened. And I had to figure all this out in a short amount of time. So the team, and I'm asking other people to do research as well, right? So the team has to learn how to be agile, delegate, research, do all this stuff, and react accordingly, and do it all kind of in that next bullet point. Do it all unsure exactly of how to do it. But when you're in doubt, slow down, develop the best response, right, before you speak. So as Chris talked about, that public spokesperson, there's a couple things there, right? One, it's always tough if you have multiple people communicating. I mean, I remember that game when you're young where you just started the rumor on this side of the room, and by the time it got around 15 people, right, it may have been this guy was asking for grapes yesterday, and by the time it gets back around here, it is he was singing Grapes of Wrath, right, and all this other stuff was going on. It's the same way with communication. If you have too many people communicating, that's how many potential stories are out there, right? 10 people communicating, there's 10 potential stories out there, versus when you control the communication, you control one story. And that's the best way to do it, because everybody else will try to spin that story regardless. So, and then don't feel the pressure. If the media comes on site, I promise you, the media will wait. So if you don't have the proper response at that time, gather your thoughts, bring the team together, talk to people, bounce it off people, breathe, develop the best response, then you can respond. And I'll completely agree with Chris. A lot of times no comment to people means you're guilty. You can say, I don't have all the information. You can tell them that we're still looking at things. We're working with local authorities, right? But don't make it look like you're hiding something, because that just makes them dig deeper, harder, faster. All right, so take time, breathe first in everything that you do in your response, even how you're handling the crisis itself, right? Breathe. And then that's going to allow you to clear your head and approach things from a non-panic manner. All right, and then kind of that steps to prepare, you got to determine the best practices, right? We've got to control and tell our story, no hiding our hands. We're not ostriches. We're not putting our heads in the sand. We want to control and tell our story. And if you're telling your story, that gives other people less opportunity to tell it, right? Because then they're having to debunk what you've already said versus just spin it the way they want. Got to have that plan developed. If we wouldn't have had a plan developed in these situations, it would have been catastrophic in some areas, right? Especially on some of the larger incidents. And then training. If we wouldn't have trained our people to be able to handle it, the chain of command, the way a chain of communication, the way everything gets handed off to each individual person, and what their role is, if we wouldn't have had that, then that would have been much worse, because everybody would have been trying to not only deal with a crisis, but figure out how to deal with a crisis all in the spur of the moment. And you don't want that to happen. And then, this is in capital letters, all bold, can't say it enough. Practice, practice, practice. just going through this once, right? If you had a company come in and help you develop something and go through this, and they went through it just once with you, that's not enough, right? You got to set some periodic practice where you're going over this so it's staying fresh, because you might not get a crisis every year. So you don't want to say, if you use it, you lose it. You want to make sure that you're continuing on with those type of things. That way you are prepared always, not just once. So at that, I'll turn that back over to Chris to talk more about kind of speaking with the media.
Yeah. David, those are fantastic takeaways, and I can't emphasize enough the practice. So, and we'll be talking about that yet again. And we're wrapping up here. So if you have any questions, feel free to fire away. Last section that we want to talk about is speaking with the media, just like David mentioned. So we have some tips that I know I'm just going to kind of touch the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, on how to handle how to communicate, I should say, with the media, and take away what David mentioned as well, is have a conversation, and that's really what it is. But up throughout this discussion we've been preparing, and now it's to the point of, okay, we're prepared, we're ready, we have our information, we know what we're going to say, we know how we're going to say it. It's time to do it. So the first thing here is, I apologize in advance, I'm going to read this, but I think it's important that the takeaway from this is an interview is not an intellectual exercise. We don't want you to have an argument. We don't want you to get into any discussions beyond what the topic is. However, it is an opportunity to deliver specific messages to specific audiences with the reporter as the conduit. And I think if you've never done an interview or been in a situation where you are forced, if you will, or step up to be that spokesperson, the last line is it. It sums it all up. Use the reporter or reporters as the conduit to amplify your message. That's really what it comes down to. But again, there's, I've said this throughout the discussion today, the word opportunity, and hopefully that you're seeing that just in this short time that we're together. To take that one step further, utilizing the reporter as a conduit, it's important for you to say what you want your audience to know. So, excuse me, I'll use the instance of the fire in Tampa. You're utilizing the reporters in the media to amplify the fact that everything is okay. The harbor, the port is not shut down. It may have been for a short amount of time, but we're reopened and business is normal. But the reality of it is you're using that reporter or reporters to amplify those key messages and have that conversation. And before I share with you how to handle the media and the packaged answer approach, I think it's important for you also to think about what that message is going to be. And I can't tell you how many times we've sat down with clients and worked with them through this point where they all say, the media got it wrong. And my first response is always, well, what did you share with them? How much information did you share? Well, we talked for a good hour and a half. Well, there's a good reason that they got it wrong, because you gave them too much information. So having the ability to think in terms of sound bites and speaking in that 10 to 15 to 20 second world eliminates the ability to have misinformation or the wrong information shared. So that's just another little tip here. So let's get into how to really speak with the media. And you can see here, our lovely assistant is kind of questioning this, the packaged answer approach. So it's just like it says, there's 3 bullet points. And if you think of it as, I'm a visual person. So I always think of, what is my key message? What are the facts I want to back it up? And then what is that key message again? And that's literally how you communicate with the media. So with that, I'll give you a quick example. In the situation of the harbor fire, the key message is that our company is working with the local authorities. So what I would say in that instance is, if in an interview process, the very first thing I want to say is, we're working with local authorities, the fire department, the city, the municipality, to manage the situation. And I can assure you that everything is under control at this time. And that is being done. We're managing that process through our safety program. We're working with the fire department who has multiple engines on site, and they are reducing the flames, and we're contained the fire where it started. And again, I'd like to reiterate that we are working with local authorities to make sure that this situation is managed properly. If you hear that and you see what's going on, there's no way that you can take anything other than a positive information or information about the project or the situation, I should say, in a way that is going to be damaging. And that's ultimately, when we went back to the beginning of this discussion, that's what we want to eliminate. We want to reduce and slow the damage in terms of our corporate reputation and manage the situation. And as David said, have that conversation. So here's the challenge though with that. It's always to close with that key message, because it does a couple things. It lets the reporter know and the audience know that that's pretty important. And more importantly, it kind of bookends the conversation so that you have the ability to simply state, yes, we are working with local authorities. We're not handling this on our own, and back it up. And then again, reiterate the fact that there is cooperation on this scenario. So, and as you can see, our assistant says, yeah, that makes sense. So hopefully you feel the same way. So to sum this up, obviously we want you to establish your communications plan, your crisis communications plan. Understand the expectations around the media and what does that entail. Know your rights, because as a leader of the company or in a situation that you are, the on-site manager, you have rights in this discussion. And again, it's a conversation. So make sure that you have that comfort level. Again, packaging your answers. And I'd like to reinforce what David has said, practice. I can't emphasize it enough. Practicing every scenario that you could possibly think of. And as David shared with us today, we can practice and prepare for everything, but having a camera crew jump out of an ambulance is probably something that I'll be honest with you, I didn't think of until David and I spoke. So one last thing I'd like to leave you with, and this is just a quote from Stephen King. There's no harm in hoping for the best as long as you're prepared for the worst. And I think that is emblematic of his writing, but more importantly, I think it really sums up what we're focusing here today. So I think we have some time to take some questions. And with that, I thank you in advance, and we'll go from there.
So we did have one question come through. What tips do you have for dealing with anonymous posts or pictures or videos of a crisis that are posted by individuals that are not part of the media?
That's a good question. I always say, well, our approach here at Atlas Marketing is to always do your best to have the conversation offline first. If there's misinformation on social media or pictures or videos, and to David's point, if there's a legal ability to say, hey, wait, this is wrong, I would go that route, obviously. But having the opportunity to have a discussion with a person offline and then be able to come back and either remove the post or have a response to that post. Obviously, if it's a completely far-fetched, unrelated issue, I've seen some things where, things came out of the blue, and you know, there's a crisis situation or a situation for a healthcare system, for example, and somebody started posting political manifestos, if you will. You know, just delete those, just get rid of them. You know, those, you don't really need to engage with those things because they're just going to continue to, they're just looking for a platform. But if it is something that is relevant to the situation, again, I encourage you to take that offline, have that discussion, and then come back and follow up with that. One last thing, I guess I forgot to mention, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or David. Our emails are there. You could, you know, if you have any other additional thoughts or needs, feel free.